listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and today it is the morning of Saturday, the 26th of November, 2022 in Seoul, and I'm joined via Zoom from Seattle, Washington by Dr. Simone Chun to talk about U.S. policy on Korea, Korean division, peace in Korea, things like that. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you all, please, to leave a review about this podcast wherever you can. On Spotify, you can leave a rating, but not a review, but please do that anyway. Apple Podcast allows both, and on YouTube, you can like and subscribe. Secondly, check out nknews.org and consider buying a subscription. Third, follow me on Twitter at JackoZ and NK News at nknews.org. For podcast questions and suggestions and feedback, you can tweet at us or you can email us at podcast@nknews.org. All right, my guest today, Dr. Simone Chun, is a teacher and researcher on U.S. foreign policy on Korea. She's an active member of the Korea Peace Network and a member of the Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea's Steering Committee. She has a PhD from the University of California at Santa Barbara and contributes regularly to Truth Out, Counterpunch, Hangyeore, and other progressive media outlets. And you can find her on Twitter at Simone Chun, and we'll put that link in the show notes. Hello, Simone, and welcome on the NK News podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Could you start by telling us about the Korea Peace Network? What is it and what does it do and who's in it?
So Korea Peace Network is non-governmental NGOs and a grassroots organization based in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And this is umbrella and broader alliance that includes Korean Americans and also American peace activists and scholars, and also those who work specifically also for lobbying U.S. Congress, and also umbrella of American peace organizations. And it was formed, it is not really formally, established, but it has been organized and active since 2018 and 2019 and 2021. And Korea Peace Network has been specifically has been very active in the advocacy and especially lobbying Congress for peace agreement in the Korean Peninsula.
And how do you feel that's going at the moment?
I think that the best, it was the most active time was during, actually the Trump administration. So when they're doing the, 3 summits. And it has been, since that, it has greater difficulties because of, as you can see, the continuing obstacles in the and also returning to more hardline policies towards North Korea. And there has been some obviously major challenges. But I think that on the other hand, the good news is that the grassroots organization has been growing, and especially on the front of Korean Americans. Probably, I think this is, in my memory, this is probably the first time when Korean Americans, the critical mass of Korean Americans are directly involved in the Korea peace movement. So I think in that sense, this is truly historic moment, despite the fact that a lot of challenges.
Would you say it's largely a Korean American driven organization or network?
Yes, it is Korean American driven organization. And I think those who have the most have contributed are the one, in fact, actually second generation of Korean Americans. I think that you have interviewed Christine An, for instance, previously. Yes. And also the Koreans, like myself, I was born and obviously I was raised and I got most of my education in Korea until I came to the United States for my graduate study. And also there are a lot of Koreans who live in the United States, Koreans who have a lot of connections with all the, what's happening in Korea and the politics and the foreign affairs. And they're also have greater influence and contribution. So to answer your question, yes, it is primarily, led by the Koreans and living in the United States, and also Korean Americans.
Yeah.
And, with a great solidarity with the amazing American peace activists who obviously have a far longer history of a grassroots peace movement.
Now, you're also, as I said in the introduction, a member of the steering committee of the Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
The alliance is that is mostly scholars, scholars, and focusing on the Korea, and it is
Which
progressive.
fields of scholarship are they from?
Scholarship, it's a multidisciplinary,
Yeah.
political science, anthropology, history. So it is interdisciplinary research and scholars.
Yeah.
It is, as I said, it's more progressive scholars who wanted to contest the more established or discourse on, especially inter-Korean and also U.S. North Korean relations. So that is, it was formed especially when in response to the U.S., the continuing sort of a somewhat to provide a critical analysis on the Korean War, especially the role of the United States has played. And and also these days we have more also trying to create more, critical academics, let's say, analysis and also research and also educational tools to inform, especially, Americans who may not be well informed about the Korean history and Korean War.
Now, you've lived in the United States for many years. How do you understand U.S. policy towards North Korea?
I think U.S. policy towards North Korea, it has a pretty sort of bipartisan, consensus, which is looking at North Korea as the enemy instead of a country where the United States can, coexist. United States can diplomatically acknowledge, and which also obviously starting from the Korean War, those who somewhat have a different opinion about the Korean War, but the Korean War, where the United States committed and what is almost amount to genocide, which is meaning that almost 20 to 30% of Koreans were basically injured or who were killed, and the majority of those the violence were, committed by American soldiers. But in spite of the role the U.S. played in that Korean War, United States has, for the last, in my view, now it's entering to almost 9th decade, refused to sign a agreement that can end the Korean War. And overall, I think the bottom line is continuing hostile policy towards the North, and also therefore perpetuating really the tragedy. And as you know, Korea has been one nation, and for centuries, and now has been remaining divided, and also most likely, unless U.S. changes policy towards hostile policy towards North Korea, it will probably continue. South Korea will continue to remain divided. So, in a nutshell, I think the U.S. hostile policy toward North Korea has been, it defines. And as I see in the United States, it's not just on the analysis side. And when I had a chance to meet with some of those members of Congress and policy analysts, and it's very startling to see how, number one, how little they're know about the history of Korea, or for that matter, North Korea, and also how they're has almost bipartisan consensus on maintaining that hostile policy towards the North.
And how do you contrast that with the North Korean policy towards the U.S.?
I think North Korean policy towards the United States is, if you look at the media, well, especially in the United States, most of the media coverage is so negative and also ignorant of North Korea. It's hard to, see any other alternative. So in that sense, North Korea is a threat to the United States. Although North Korea that has only between 30 to, let's say, 60, 80 nuclear weapons, as opposed to the United States that has more, 5,000 nuclear weapons. So the idea that that North Korea can be a threat to the United States, for some it could be pretty. It's not the sensible interpretation. But North Korea, as far as people in the United States and especially policymakers concerned, it's possession of nuclear weapons is also a greater threat, not only to the United States and also to the entire world. So that is the way North Korea is defined. So it is pretty difficult to contest that. Nevertheless, if you look at from North Korean point of view, as a country that has always almost experienced through such a terrible war, and pretty much during Korean War, the complete experience complete decimation or genocidal level. I think it is somewhat it's understandable why North Korea want to develop its deterrence capability. And in that sense, I guess it's just complete from the historical perspective and background. I think there is an argument that can be made that North Korea's position, that is, again, I said, to its need to develop its defense and also continue to consistently demand diplomatic engagement and also normalization with the United States. It is a sensible policy, which United States, I guess, even these days, refused to give to North Korea.
You've brought in the Korean War a couple of times. How do you see the beginning of the Korean War, and is it important to understand correctly how the war began?
The war began. The war did not begin in 1950, as we understand our textbook says us. It was actually, as you know, Korea was colonized by the Japanese for 35 years. That's brutal colonization, and then Korean War and kind of halted. The Japanese colonization halted ended in 1945. And immediately after the Japanese colonization liberation, South Korea was under 3 years of U.S. military government. And during that time, and South Korea had right-wing pro-U.S. President recent month. And during that time, there has almost a massive, before even the Korean War started, there was a massive repression and a war against anybody who were supporting unified Korea, who opposed a divided Korea, who sought independence through movement. And those are all, I guess, categorized as communist sympathizers, leftists. And there was thousands of Koreans were basically repressed and murdered and eliminated. Now, so in that sense, what I'm saying is the Korean War did not start 1950, and in a way, the U.S.-led and South Korean right-wing government supported massive repression against the progressive Korean leftists. Was also the prelude to the Korean War. Now, about the Korean War, some argue that it was a civil war. If you like people like Bruce Cummings, it was a civil war where United States intervened, and others thought the other side argument will be North Korea invaded South Korea. And whatever view you have, the fact of the matter is that it is the unprecedented level of U.S. involvement, U.S. part the U.S. played in the almost it's the brutal campaign. And as you know, more bombs were dropped on the Korean soil than the entire Pacific campaign against Japanese during World War II, and so much so that I think one of the best statements about the Korean War was no other than General Douglas MacArthur, who says in his congressional testimony, he said something like he has never seen such level of devastation, and he said if you're continuing, I assume the United States, if you're continuing this war, it's meant to the slaughter, the kind of slaughter that he has never heard in history of mankind. I think that's pretty much the accurate kind of assessment of the Korean War.
Do you see the Soviet and Chinese interventions as being important in this history?
Soviet and Chinese intervention was important, and to the extent that there was also, I don't know, it was the already even during at the end of World War II, it was now the Cold War started, and Soviet and China certainly did play a role, and even if you look at those scholars who look at their greater role in affecting North Korea. That being said, though, I think if you look at it, the level of destruction, especially what happened after the Korean War. So, for instance, as you recall, the armistice was signed in 1953. Now, according to the armistice, that's signed by, including the United States, there's all foreign troops should be withdrawn, and you cannot introduce any new weapons, and etc. And also, the armistice agreement also stipulate that within 90 days of the signing the agreement, they're supposed to have a peace agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I'm saying this is because of United States was involved, and all superpowers were involved, but what they did after the signing of the armistice is to some extent more important than even the war itself. And United States, in my view, violated almost all those the armistice agreement, and introducing already nuclear weapons, which they kept until 1991, and pretty much perpetuating the division and the Korean War, and also hostile policy against North Korea as a sort of cover for its Cold War against, obviously, Soviet Union. And now looks like it's launching another new Cold War against China. And so as far as, that's why, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of great peace movements, and not only Korean Americans and American peace activists, and even including the Moon Jae-in administration, previous administration, have tried to make some progress. And I think there are a lot of people who are pretty pessimistic and skeptical about any prospect of peace or settlement in Korea, as long as the United States maintain its policy of, like containment. It's a containment policy. So,
well, let's talk about that time when Moon Jae-in was president of South Korea and Donald Trump was president of the United States. It seems to me that there was a lot of talks, there were a lot of summits. What were, in your views, the obstacles that blocked inter-Korean reconciliation or constructive diplomacy at that time?
Yes, that's when actually I was very active with the peace organizations. I also was in Seoul right before the first summit, and Trump, despite of all that effort, including, President Moon Jae-in and also Trump. Actually, if you look at the record, there is more Americans' hardline policy, maximum pressure policies did not change. And there's more new sanctions against North Korea. And every time and also all those inter-Korean agreements were pretty much obstructed by the Trump administration. And those of you who were in the United States at the time, I have a so vivid memory, for instance, during the American media that, covers that summit. It was pretty, it was, shocking how literally a lot of those, the what I call hardliners, hawkish, people like John Bolton, and their view were pretty much in my view, was more mainstream view of Americans. And it was almost fear that, about any peace breaking out on the Korean Peninsula. And so I think short answer to your question is that President Moon Jae-in, I think he had a genuine interest, and also he did very vigorously pursue for peace, but I don't think he was realistic to some extent, and he subordinated too much to Trump's pressure. And
well, you mentioned John Bolton. You haven't mentioned Steve Biko, who was very active at that time. What do you see as his role in that period?
Steve Biko, I think that a lot of us were actually quite enthusiastic to some extent was Steve Biko, but it looks like he also his role was somewhat limited at the end of the Trump administrations, and I think that he pretty much the Trump administration, the hardliners took over, and I think that was our impression.
Now, I don't want to put words in Steve Biko's mouth because he's not here to join us today, but I have actually spoken to him on the podcast. I'm not sure if you've heard that episode or not, but Mr. Biko said that towards the end of his time, it wasn't so much the hardline American policy as the fact that the North Koreans were not interested in talking.
The North Koreans were not interested in talking also because the Americans, Americans refused to, a Trump administration refused to really give any concrete things such as reducing or ending U.S. South Korea joint military exercises, and also ending hostile policy towards North Korea, and also obviously they're lifting those sanctions.
But those exercises had stopped since the Singapore summit, as I recall.
Yeah, that stopped, but I think that the North Korea action, that was stopped, but it was not. North Korea wanted to something more. That is more towards the ending the U.S. Hostile policy, and I think the Trump administration was never interested in giving those things that North Korea thought very critical and is vital. And at the end, I think in North Korea, I mean, I cannot really, probably, there are others who have more information about North Korea's position at the time. But at the end of the round of talk, North Korea, I think, came down with the conclusion that Trump administration was not really serious about, the permanent peace and also normalizing with North Korea. I think that is my impression.
So what's your vision of peace building on the Korean Peninsula? How should that proceed?
One, I must say that unless we have accurate analysis or understanding of U.S. foreign policy, I don't think peace is going to be possible in the Korean Peninsula in the either short run or long run. In the short run, I do not see any, progress under Biden and Yoon administration. In the long run, also, Americans, is to me is significant. An important component of U.S. foreign policy is imperialism, and it is central.
Can you define that? What do you mean by imperialism exactly?
Imperialism to mean that it has a powerful country have a greater control over weaker states with regard to its territory, its a security force, national defense, and also other economic resources. For instance, as you know, South Korea does not have operational control of its national military force called OPCON.
We have to clarify for our listeners that is a complicated. We don't want to oversimplify it. You said that South Korea does not have operational control.
Does not have OPCON. So operational control means that having the control of its own defense force. Now, because it
does during peacetime, and during wartime, they have something called a combined forces command. So it's not as if the U.S. military simply tells the South Korean military every day what to do. You're aware that there's a difference between OPCON and peacetime and OPCON and wartime, and you're familiar with the combined forces command, aren't you?
Exactly. So, but still, the fact of the matter is that it was developed during Korean War, and it continued and dictates pretty much South Korea military operate independently only.
But it's also true that during the Korean War, the soldiers of all other nations, so from Australia to Belgium to Colombia, South Africa, Turkey, all of these forces were under the United States command. And I don't know if we could say that that's an example of U.S. imperialism.
The fact of the matter is that it's continued. South Korea is probably, this is more even from independent international research institute like Institute for Security and Development Policy, and it's quite a unique case where foreign troops have command over on other countries, which is in the case of South Korea. In any modern time, there's only country like before it was Afghanistan or even Iraq have that kind of foreign troops have that kind of control. So in that sense, I meant imperialism, and also South Korea, the role of a military-industrial complex in the United States. I think all of us are aware of how important role that they play, and they're informing. Thus, it kind of complements their informing and driving U.S. foreign policy. And not only that, the United States also imperialistic in this up to the extent that, as I think it was Trump who says that basically South Korea, cannot do anything without approval, United States approval. So I think it is South Korea does not enjoy, implement, practice its full sovereignty, especially when you're, and you also host 28,000 U.S. troops stationed all over South Korean soil, and I think this is so. It is, to me, if it's not an imperialistic policy, I'm not sure what other term would you use.
Well, I think that I'm very hesitant to use the word imperialism here. When I think of imperialism, I think of what Russia is doing in Ukraine right now as an example of actual imperialism. In South Korea, which is a sovereign nation, the government of the Republic of Korea has, of its own accord, signed an alliance with the United States. So those 28,000 troops that you referred to, they're here because the South Korean government wants them here. If the South Korean government tomorrow said, we're done with the alliance, we don't need the troops anymore, they'd have to go home, wouldn't they?
In principle, they can, but in actually, South Koreans do not have that kind of authority.
They do not? How do we know that?
That kind of power. And also another will be there are considerable, obviously, number of percentage population, especially the conservative, who wants the continuing U.S. military presence within South, in part because they looked at without North Korean threat, without American force in South Korea, their conservative position will, they will lose their reason to exist to the extent that, so there's a lot even opposition for any ending any U.S. I would say what I consider as U.S. occupation of South Korea.
Do you see any sign that progressive presidents of South Korea, such as Moon Jae-in, Roh Moo-hyun, Kim Dae-jung, that they tried to get the U.S. forces to leave?
They are politicians. I don't think that they ever explicitly advocated that. And
but is it politics or is it occupation? I mean, they're very different words, aren't they?
No, what I'm saying is that because they're politicians,
Yes.
I don't think they explicitly would advocate the the demanding American troops, withdrawing of American troops or leaving American troops South Korea. I don't think they have done it, but there however, so politicians, political leaders, whether it's a progressive or left progressive or conservative, no president have advocated. However, within South Korea, there's progressive forces who basically look at American troops as occupying forces. And as long as you have Americans who occupy South Korea, you're going to have this policy of containment policy, which again, it's containing China and restraining South Korea to serve as U.S. interest, as a South Korea as a sort of frontline post to promote interest. That's not going to change. So I think to answer your question, no, South Korean, none of the existing or previous Korean president ever supported or demanding the U.S. the withdrawing of U.S. occupying forces in South Korea.
Do you think there's a lot of public support in South Korea for the removal of U.S. forces?
Opinion poll says no, and in fact, depending on opinion poll, it's more Koreans support the American forces stationed in South Korea.
Do you think they would agree with your use of the word occupation? I mean, that's an emotional word, isn't it? It's a laden term, occupation, imperialism.
I don't think they are. Why would they be emotional term? I think it is. You let's say 28,000 American forces stationed in South Korea.
I'll tell you
So
why it's an emotional term, because the term occupation and imperialism very clearly reject the agency of the nation that these words are being imposed upon. I've phrased that badly. I should say that in another way. That by using the terms imperialism and occupation, it seems to reduce South Korean agency to zero, to reduce South Korea to a passive object, which is having the will of America forced upon it.
I think that could look at that way. However, it is also, I think, the reality that South Korea, I would say, the South Korea sovereignty is greatly limited. If it's not, I mean, we can talk about varying degree of imperialism and occupation, I suppose, but I don't think it's necessarily so emotional or negative to that extent. It is just, to me, it's just accurate. And if you look at, almost all the decisions that South Korea makes with regard, especially with its foreign policy towards related to North Korea and also especially in U.S. South Korean relations, I don't think South Korea is an equal partner. I don't think South Korea exerts its full sovereign power. And they call U.S. South Korea alliance as ironclad alliance.
Yes.
Definitely, it is not a alliance between two equal powers. And so if it's not, what is it? So,
when you say it's not an alliance of two equal powers, do you mean in terms of strength or in terms of what?
Yeah, in terms of all aspects. It's all aspects. Again, going back to the Americans having its control over South Korean military. And also, especially right now, we have the new sort of a Cold War with China. Now, America is dictating more sort of pressure on South Korea to join the new Cold War against China. And if you look at all these areas where America has greater control, and at the same time refusing to or blocking any inter-Korean rapprochement, reconciliation, despite the rhetoric, I think it's pretty accurate to say that South Korea, despite of its now 10th largest economy, and it's South Korea, despite its if you look at the military, sixth largest, most powerful military force, having 600,000 active men on duty, it's not able to exercise its sovereignty, and especially under right-wing presidents like Yoon Suk-yeol, and before that it was. For instance, it's a predecessor, the Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. So I think, so what you have is that it's a form of I will still consider the United States occupying force is implementing its imperialistic policy with considerable support within South Korea, those right-wing political groups or politicians who benefit from perpetual division. And also continuing the Korean War, we all know that.
When you say continuing the Korean War, what actually do you mean? Because my understanding is that it's the role of the armistice forces to make sure that there's no fighting. So when you say continuing the Korean War, do you actually mean continuing fighting, that the United States wants to keep fighting North Korea until unification is achieved through defeating North Korea? Is that what you mean?
I did continuing war. It means that the Korean War has not obviously ended. It's still technically, Korea is in a war.
Right, but there's no fighting. There's what we call an armistice. The armistice is held for the last 70 years. So what What do you mean? How do
So
you
what I
define that as continuing the war?
so what I'm saying is that the maintaining the tension with North Korea. So that means that in a way that continuing tension with North Korea will justify U.S. presence in the Korean Peninsula. Suppose tomorrow Biden administration decided that something that can actually United States can do easily if it has a will, um, normalize with North Korea, decide to coexist with North Korea. And as many Korean American peace activists and also many peace activists are working on peace agreement, peace treaty. If do that, there's no tension, at least reducing the tension in the Korean. And if that happens, it's not good news for a lot of American established, let's say, military-industrial complex and others, because American troops, there's no reason for American troops to be stationed in the Korean Peninsula.
In the last month, we've seen a greater number of missiles fired by North Korea than ever before, as well as 150 or 180 sorties of North Korean Air Force planes very close to the demilitarized zone. Now, I've read some of your op-ed pieces, and often when you write about North Korean aggression or North Korean threats, you place the word aggression or threats in scare quotes as if to suggest they're not actually aggression or threats. So in your view, does North Korea ever carry out real aggression or threats or have a hostile policy?
Hostile policy to whom? Against whom?
Yes, I was going to let you answer that.
I said hostile policy against which party?
Well, okay, then let me forget hostile policy for a moment. When North Korea fires missiles and flies airplanes near the demilitarized zone, is that aggression or threats, or do you see that as, I mean, what actually is that?
Let's suppose, so you recall that how many joint military war games between United States and South Korea have conducted, even, let's say even this year alone, right? And we have from March through all the way to August, you had a series of, it was almost hyper military joint exercises with the United States. And I guess the assumption, that which is, as far as North Korea concerns, they also have to respond to that. So it's
But what does North Korea see of those? You're talking about the joint exercises. How does North Korea know about joint exercises? What does North Korea see or experience of these joint drills and exercises?
I think those are the North Korea look at, those exercises are not just exercises. Those are, some we call it the war games. And
right, but they're not visible. What I mean is you can't see them with a pair of binoculars if you're standing at the demilitarized zone. So how does North Korea experience these exercises?
They find it as this is a threat to North Korea, and also.
But how do they know they're happening?
How do you know they're happening?
Yes.
How can they not know it's happening? They also happening all of the news. They can also see from their intelligence source. And North Korea, and also those are annual war games are scheduled, and also
so they know that they're happening from the media.
They will also have, North Korea will also have to they also mobilize their defense forces to confront that, in an emergency case. Now, the point is that you talked about why do North Korea conduct all this missile? Are they any hostile?
Well, yeah, because you use the words aggression and threats in scare quotes, and I think that's a deliberate choice. And I wonder why you do that. Are they not aggression or threats?
I'm using the quote because when I quote other scholars, other analysts, and also because North Korea, a lot of North Korea missile tests and those exercise they are doing is all specifically in response to continuing U.S. and South Korea exercises. And also on the other hand, the other side, North Korea we already know is they have nuclear weapons. And also, without any permanent peace settlement and peace treaty, North Korea have its right to defend themselves. That's why they do need to
But
develop.
defend themselves against what exactly? What are they defending themselves
In this
against?
case, if you look at it specifically, North Korea, I think their enemies, they still consider the United States as being the biggest enemy of the North Korea's sovereignty, and South Korea being presumably secondary. South Korea, not South Korean people, but South Koreans, those forces that support the U.S. Aggressive posture toward North Korea. So in that sense, I guess the North Korea's policies, North Korea's position is pretty consistent. It is a demanding, again, in whether using developing nuclear weapons or testing those missiles. It is still continue to demand normalization and coexistence with the United States, and demand U.S. and its hostile policy toward North. And I think that is pretty much the North Korea's policy, and it has been, and I think it will be, unless United States. Again, the United States decide to coexist and normalize relations with North Korea.
Does North Korea have a hostile policy towards South Korea?
North and South Korea, as you know, it is a one nation, and I think during the Moon Jae-in administration, during the work towards peace, and we had this expression that country, we are one nation, we only separated from just the last 80 years or so. Now, North Korea has hostile policy towards South Korea if South Korea opposes inter-Korean rapprochement. If South Korea, instead of thinking about it, a shared history, shared national, one nation, if South Korea, more supports U.S. imperialistic policy. Yes, if that happened, I think North Korea will look at South Korea as an enemy.
During the last years of President Moon Jae-in's time in the Blue House in South Korea, the North Koreans, I don't know if you're looking at North Korean state media, but they were saying some horrible things about President Moon Jae-in, whom you just described earlier as clearly being very interested in inter-Korean reconciliation and rapprochement, but they called him all sorts of names. They blew up the inter-Korean liaison building in Kaesong. These are clearly hostile acts. Why was North Korea so hostile, even when the South Korean government was the closest that you could imagine to achieving what North Korea actually wanted?
Well, South Korea did not fully implement the inter-Korean agreement and summit agreement. And South Korea, at the end, even despite President Moon Jae-in's effort, it could not really resist those forces from the United States that tried to sabotage the inter-Korean agreement. And so that's where I think North Korea was more they were somewhat disappointed. And
disappointment is one thing, but this was hostile. Blowing up a building which was the inter-Korean liaison office, was that an act of disappointment or an act of hostility in your view?
I think that there was also specifically in response to the Trump administration's sabotaging inter-Korean agreement. It was that there was a great expectation about not only between U.S. and DPRK, but also two Koreas, and every single step of the way, United States blocked those inter-Korean reconciliation. And so I think in that sense, that North Korea, it was this protest. Obviously, personally, I wish it didn't happen, but that was the way North Korea wanted to deal with it. And another thing about you talk about these are all things you're coming from Pyongyang. I think some of them are rhetorics and just the way that Americans, the American rhetoric, media, and also the policymaker rhetoric towards North Korea. Basically that says they obliterate North Korea, and so I think in that level, rhetorics on both sides. But on the other hand, if you look at those during the summit under President Moon Jae-in, under President Moon Jae-in, I mean, those of who know Korean, if you follow those summit, I was blown away. I'm listening to following in Korean, all the things, the way they communicate in Korean. And
What do you mean? Why were you blown away?
blown away because first of all, it was, we still think that although I'm Korean, I still think North Korea, it's because it's one nation, but because we have been separated for so long, I think in both Koreas, we tend to think a little bit differently. But when I saw the two leaders, even Kim Jong-un expressing, some of those things that you will normally, hear from my fellow South Koreans, the kind of words that they use, the greetings and even humor and little discourse, the Korean language, the common language that we have. And when I saw that, to me that's something that you don't see in the rhetoric. Let's say what is hostile rhetoric that North Korea, coming out from Pyongyang, and so I think that my point is that sometimes you kind of have to look at beyond that rhetoric and beyond the surface and look at underneath that there is that a nation that have still great commonalities and their history. And I think people kind of forget that. And I think earlier I mentioned, and before we start recording, I remember, meeting this North Korean scholar in Hong Kong, and for 2 days we were speaking. The whole time we were speaking in English, and then at the end, for a couple of hours, we were both looking at each other, and I said, "Oh my God, we can communicate in Korean." So we start talking in Korean, and it was quite an experience. And what I found was, earlier I said I'm kind of pretty pessimistic about peace breaking out in Korea in any immediate future. That's one thing actually that I do remember. There's something that probably the only hope that the only hope in Korea is not even maybe even Washington, even in a policy level, that there's something that two Koreas still have, that is still the language, that the tradition, the culture, and history, which our private sort of memories, a private history can kind of carry, and the bonds that still the two Koreas have. I think that's where lies biggest hope.
Well, looking beyond the rhetoric for a moment there, what do you actually believe is North Korea's ultimate goal or objective? What does the government of Pyongyang, what does Kim Jong-un want at the end of the day?
It's hard to answer the question. I honestly have to say I don't know, because I don't want to claim that what's going on inside of Kim Jong-un's head. But I do, based on what he said, or what also the North Korean, I guess the representative stated. I think there's still in the deep down, there is sense that they would like to have a country that is that does not have to have this under the constant sort of threat of war from the United States, or for them at any country. I think they do want to have a country where they can peacefully coexist with the South Korea.
In the long term, or is this like a short-term intermediate step to something else?
I think there will be, to long term, it will be long term goal. But to get to have that long term goal, North Korea especially has the confront the biggest obstacle. That is, again, I'm going back to United States, and you cannot have you cannot implement any national economic or development, or any normal kind of national development, when you are constantly under the threat of really nuclear war, even from the United States. And so that is why they are, I'm not trying to defend North Korea, but I mean, it seems sensible for them to at least take care of that. They, being able to defend themselves, and then go on to, moving on to net economic development. In fact, I remember when I was talking to the North Korean scholar more than 10 years ago, and that's what they said, because I was asking the same question that you're asking right now. So I was asking, why don't you guys just focusing on, I would say, economic development instead of spending, such enormous resource on the military. And I'm sure you have heard, too. His portion was, first we have to take care of the national, we have to be able to protect ourselves because we're under threat of the United States. And then
I have trouble understanding that. It's very difficult to, the way that you put it here, it sounds as if North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons, the United States would invade North Korea tomorrow. Is that kind of how you look at it?
I think it is not. I guess not so much how I look at it. I think it's the way the North Koreans. I think probably they were thinking.
But that can't be right, because North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons during the 1950s, and the United States didn't invade after the Korean War. Then North Korea did not have nuclear weapons in the 1960s, and the United States did not invade. North Korea did not have nuclear weapons in the 1970s. I could repeat myself for the 1980s and the 1990s. So in all of these decades, the United States didn't defend or take 1 inch of North Korean territory. And now we're supposed to believe that North Korea feels that only with nuclear weapons can it defend itself from the United States. What is the exact threat that's going on here? What's the threat?
I think the exact threat is precisely that the United States refused to end the war. The exact threat, whether it's a nuclear or conventional weapons, the United States is the only country. In fact, actually, if you look at all the world history, and every war has a beginning and an end. Even the Homer in ancient time wrote a big Iliad and Odyssey. Over 10 years war was long, but he wrote they can produce the classic work. 100 years of war between France and England ended. So every war has beginning and end. But the only war that has not really, it's halted, it's not ended, the Korean War. That means that North Korea, regardless whether it's nuclear weapons, regardless whether it's conventional weapons, North Korea is under the threat by the United States.
What precisely is the threat posed by an armistice? An armistice means ceasefire, stop shooting, stop firing. What is the threat that is posed by a ceasefire exactly? I don't understand that.
So the ceasefire is simply it's halting the war, so halting the fighting.
Right, but what is the threat of the halt of a war? How is that a threat?
Halting the war, but you can anytime you can start the war. That's the state of the Korean peninsula. It's not. That's not. It's precisely. There's no peace treaty, right? Ending the war. So that's the difference between Korean War that is in the armistice and the Korean and the other state that North Korea, and also a lot of Koreans and also a lot of Americans also in the United States in the peace activists. The one is declaring and signing a peace treaty that says Korean War has ended, and the United States can coexist with North Korea and normalize with North Korea, but that is not that's not happening, and in my view, is not going to happen anytime soon. Thus, North Korea, United States poses a threat to North Korea.
You're very critical of the United States and South Korea as political leadership, especially presidents to the right of center, such as the current President Yoon. Do you ever criticize North Korea?
You know what? I criticize North Korea to the extent that North Korea, yes, I do. I'm aware of those scholars who, let's say, criticize North Korea's human rights violations. North Korea is posing a threat to not only the United States and the world. The problem is this: I cannot do anything to affect what North Korea is going to do. Now, that's where I think the difference. So no matter how much I wanted to criticize North Koreans, there's no way that I can affect what North Korean leaders are going to do. But what I think as a Korean and also scholar operating living in the United States who have some access to let's say the media and also scholarly community, etc. I think I can have a little bit of maybe power ability to affect what United States and South Korean government are going to do. So that's what I'm saying is that that's more realistic because life is limited. Our resources are limited. It's only pragmatic to focus on where you can affect. So it will be I can talk about for the next 24 hours, what North Korea should do, but there's no way my influence will be zero. But if I can, I suppose, if I can, it's maybe write an op-ed here and there in the United States and also talk to the media like yourself, maybe there's a little bit of the possibility that I can have some influence.
But isn't there a messaging cost or a cost of messaging only to criticize the United States and South Korea? I think that, well, for example, is there not a risk that by not being openly critical of North Korea that you appear partisan?
I think there are a lot of people who have power and position and enormous resources to criticize North Korea. I think that I'm actually part of a very, very, very tiny minority. And you look at the entire U.S. media, the entire think tanks, the entire even the Korean media. So they have more resources, they have more power, more connections, and who can like you can round the clock criticizing North Korea. So I think that I think part of a tiny minority. So I think it is I think role that I think I should play, and I think there's a lot of views that are not represented by those who do have such power.
When people raise North Korean human rights issues, how do you respond?
What do you mean?
You've talked about North Korea is under threat. It needs to develop nuclear weapons, etc., etc. And you're not here to defend North Korea. I understand all that, but there's a lot of people who look at North Korea and see that there are human rights abuses going on there, such as not allowing its people to participate. Sorry, not allowing its people to choose not to participate in enforced political activities and veneration of the Kim Il Sung family, not vaccinating its population, spending money on weapons instead of food, not allowing its people to travel outside of its borders without calling them traitors. All of these things. When people raise North Korean human rights issues, do you say, well, look, they're important, but this is more important, the occupation of South Korea by U.S. forces and the United States hostile policy? Or I mean, how are we to approach North Korean human rights issues? What's the right way to look at them?
Number one, the state of war must end. I think North Korea's human rights violations, those are, as you recall, again, whether it's abused or even justified by the leadership, because North Korea is still under threat of war. In a war, Korean War has not ended, and therefore human rights violations more likely occur in countries that are in a war. I think that's one thing, and then second thing is again. I know there's a lot of human rights organizations that criticize and try to, address the North Korean human rights violation. In my view, you really want improve human rights situation in North Korea. Again, I will say, just let's first end the war. Let's sign a peace treaty. America's end this hostile policy against North Korea and support inter-Korean rapprochement, reconciliation. I think those are the steps. I think the focusing only North Korea is not going to solve the human rights issues there. That's my personal opinion. And secondly, if you really want to improve human rights violation of North Korea, and U.S. must pressure U.S. government to lift its sanctions. it's an embargo. No nation has suffered that long that kind of severe economic sanctions from the most powerful country on earth. It's targeting civilian economy. Literally talking about denying North Korea's exports, 90% of its exports, and how can a country even have any have semblance of normal economy under such prolonged economic embargo? So I would say if those people who consider as violation of human rights violation in North Korea, I would say address those first. Those should be the first steps.
Is there an irony that you live in the United States, a country that you see as an imperialist occupier of Korean territory, a country that North Korea sees as the enemy, a country that North Korea has said we cannot live under the same heaven together, and whose policy you believe has caused and continues to maintain Korea's tragic division? But on the other hand, you have the freedom to be a public critic and say what you believe and to lobby and push the United States government to act in a different way. Meanwhile, people in North Korea do not have those same freedoms. Is that somewhat ironic?
I don't think it's ironic. I think it's that, as all Koreans, we are sort of caught up in this truly the most tragic situation in modern history, and one nation that been one nation for centuries and divided. And I don't think it's ironic. I think it is something that we all are sort of we cannot transcend. We are well stuck in this historical situation. So yes, I am Korean, and I happen I guess I happen to be born in South Korea, and I have opportunity to come to the United States and study, and also be able to operate, live, and also do my work, and also meet amazing American peace activists and scholars. So it is a privilege, and so in that sense, I don't think it's ironic. And North Koreans, happen to be in that condition, and as a result of primarily by Americans' refusal to normalize, refusal to give a peace to this nation, and North Korea, and also North Korea's, of course, it's for their point of view, insistence on defending their sovereignty instead of what the United States want, which in my view is a complete surrender, and going back to almost like the Libyan model when it comes to solving nuclear weapons. United States, I think, still in my view, still want complete surrender by North Korea, and North Korea is not going to give in to that. So in that sense, no, I don't think it's ironic. I think it is just we're caught up in this historical situation, which we cannot, it's beyond our, to some extent, individual control. But that being said, I think it is privilege. And also I think as a Korean, I think it's my obligation and duty. It's not even my choice to do something to have one day a nation that is one that can coexist together. And I think that is the probably wishes of a lot of Koreans in both North and South Korea.
Well, I think that is a good place to end our conversation today. Thank you very much for coming on the NK News podcast today, Dr. Simone Chun.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can find her on Twitter at Simone Chun, that's CHUN. And you'll find that she's a very active Twitterer there in both English and in Korean. Ladies and gentlemen, also don't forget, if you already have an NK News subscription, please take a look at our NK Pro platform, which offers unparalleled services specifically catering to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. You can inquire about access and a free trial membership by sending an email to membership@nknews.org today. Also, with feedback, questions, or guest recommendations, send them to podcast@nknews.org. Our thanks, as always, go to Arius Dare and Brian Detz for facilitating this podcast, and to Gabby Magnuson, our post-recording producer genius. Thank you very much, and listen again next time.